"It's really quite a contraption," the officer said to his guest, a traveler out doing a bit of research in the field. "It's something else altogether." And he stepped back and cast his eyes upon the apparatus, a machine with which, indeed, he was intimately acquainted, although he still experienced a certain amount of awe when he gazed upon it. It seemed that the traveler was only there due to his desire to please the commander who had suggested that he might attend the execution of one of the soldiers, someone who had been sentenced for insubordination and for having insulted his superiors. As far as that goes, there wasn't much interest in this execution from anyone else at the penal colony either. At least there wasn't anyone else present in this low-lying valley, a rather small valley with sandy soil that was surrounded on all sides by bare cliffs. Nobody else but this officer, the traveler, and the convicted man. Someone who appeared as being somewhat of a brute, a bear of a man having a small forehead, a large mouth, and unruly black hair, and, likewise, a forlorn and wasted look upon his countenance. And then the one soldier who was standing guard, holding on to the heavy chain, a chain from which numerous smaller chains were attached, a pair going to the prisoner's hands and another for his feet, as well as one chain that was attached to his neck. And then all of these were interconnected by yet a third level of chains. Moreover, the condemned man had the stare of a well-trained dog, so that it seemed that you could just as well set him loose, and it would only be necessary to whistle at the start of the execution. He'd come at a trot. The traveler, it was obvious, didn't have much understanding for the apparatus, and seemed to be keeping to himself, pacing back and forth behind the prisoner whilst the officer was taking care of all the final preparations. At one time crawling beneath this machine that was built deep into the sandy soil, but then again climbing up to the top upon a ladder so as to make a final check on the parts that were there up high. You might think that these would be tasks that would better be left to a machinist, but the officer was quite intent upon doing this work himself. Indeed, he seemed excessively eager in his diligence. Whether now this would be due to his attachment to the contraption or simply because there wasn't anybody else to whom the work could be entrusted, it wasn't possible to say. "Now it's all ready," he finally called out as he came down from off the ladder. He was quite out of breath and totally drenched in sweat, taken in great gulps of air through his open mouth. He had forced 2 petite handkerchiefs behind the collar of his uniform. Were they his wife's? "These uniforms are way too heavy to be wearing in the tropics," the traveler remarked, something that surprised the officer as he was expecting to be questioned about the machine. "That's for sure," he responded, and then he went over to a bucket that stood to the ready so as to wash off the filth, the oil and grease that covered his hands. "But they're a sign of our homeland. We don't want to forget our homeland. Now, just have a look at this apparatus," he added right away as he both dried his hands upon a small towel and started pointing at the machine. Up until now, it had to be prepped by hand, but from here on out, it runs all by itself. The traveler nodded his head and looked to where the officer was pointing. But to ensure that what he was saying was totally accurate, the officer decided to modify his initial statement for all possible eventualities. Naturally, sometimes problems do crop up. This or that interferes with the machine's inner workings. Indeed, I certainly hope that nothing like this happens today. All the same, one has to be ready and make one's calculations accordingly. The contraption, after all, takes up to 12 hours to complete its cycle, 12 long hours during which time is continually in motion. But even if something should go awry, it's always just some small matter. We manage to overcome it without much difficulty. "Wouldn't you like to have a seat?" he finally asked, pulling out a chair from amongst a large pile of them and then offering it to the traveller, who, of course, couldn't very well refuse. He sat down right by the edge of a ditch into which he cast a fleeting look. It wasn't very deep. On the one side, the dirt had been piled up into a sort of wall. On the other side stood the apparatus. "I don't even know," the officer began, "as to whether the commander has already explained to you how this machine works." The traveller made an indefinite motion with one of his hands. The officer didn't need anything more, since this was enough to allow him to start into his own clarifications. "The apparatus," he said, and he took hold of a lever which he used to support himself, "is a testimony to the inventiveness of our former commander. I was with him right from the beginning of the earliest prototypes and worked alongside him throughout all the entirety of his endeavors, right up to its consummation. All the same, the credit for the invention belongs to him and to him alone. Incidentally, have you heard tell of our former commander? No? Well, I wouldn't be overstating the truth of it if I were to say that the overall conception of the entirety of our penal system was set down by him. He put us upon our course. Such is his legacy, his life's work. Those of us who were his friends knew even at his death that the direction had been set and that this, his design, Einrichtung, was so complete in itself that no matter who might be appointed to replace him, and despite his having thousands of grand schemes in his head, all the same, there wouldn't be a thing that might be changed for a considerable number of years after his taking charge. And our assessment of this matter has been borne out. Our new commander has been forced to admit as such. It's a shame that you never had a chance to get to know our former commander. But, the officer interrupted himself, I'm just blathering away, and all the while his apparatus is standing right here in front of us. It's made up, as you can see, from 3 parts. In the course of time, each of these parts has been given a familiar appellation. To a certain extent, our folk is quite clever in coming up with such homespun names. This lower portion is called the bed. The upper has been nicknamed the inscriber. And here, in the middle section that swings, hovering in between, this is called the harrow. The harrow? Interjected the traveller. He hadn't been listening all that attentively. The sun was beating down all too fiercely in this valley, which hadn't any shade at all. It was quite difficult to keep one's wits about one. the officer appeared that much the more astonishing, what with his tight-fitting ceremonial uniform that was simply over-brimming with numerous medals and all sorts of braided insignia. And there he was, so energetically and eagerly explaining the ins and outs of this, his baby. And then at the same time, he'd also be going about tightening a few screws here and there with a screwdriver. It seemed that the soldier standing guard found himself to be in a similar constitution as the traveler. He had wrapped the chain around his wrists a couple of turns and was supporting himself upon the butt end of his rifle, having let his head fall upon his chest, and he seemed to be 3/4 of the way into dreamland. All of this didn't surprise the traveler in the least, since they had been speaking in French, and French was a language for which certainly neither the soldier nor the condemned man had any understanding. And this, indeed, this made it all the more remarkable that the prisoner was actually making every effort to follow the officer's explanations. With a certain sort of sleepy tenacity, he would always direct his gaze upon whatever it was at which the officer was pointing. And as now the traveler interrupted the officer with his question, so, just like the officer, he immediately directed his attention upon him. "Right, the harrow," the officer responded. "The name fits. The needles are organized somewhat like spikes on a plow, and then, too, this part of the contraption moves along kind of like a harrow, even if it's over the same area, and naturally everything is done more artistically. Moreover, you'll understand it right away once we get started. Now then, it's here upon the bed that we're going to place the prisoner. That is, let me finish with my explanations first, and then we'll strap him in and put everything into action. That way you'll be able to follow it all that much the better. Not even to mention that one of the gears in the inscriber has slipped out of alignment. It makes an awful racket once the machine starts up, and it's almost impossible to talk to one another once the apparatus has been set into motion. Unfortunately, spare parts are hard to come by. It's hard to get much of anything these days. So, where was I? Here's the bed. It's totally covered over by this cotton wadding. I'll explain its purpose in due time. It's upon this wadding that the prisoner lies face down upon his stomach. Naturally, he's first been stripped naked. The straps down here are for his feet, those are for his hands, and then the top one goes around his neck. He's strapped in quite firmly. Now, up at the top, there's this little felt-covered stop that's easily adjusted so that it goes right into his mouth. Its purpose is to prevent the prisoner from screaming out, and it also protects him from biting his tongue. Naturally, the prisoner doesn't have any choice but to take it, otherwise the strap here would break his neck. You say this wadding is made up of cotton? The traveler interjected yet another question, and he bent over so that he could examine it. Yes, it certainly is, the officer responded with a smile. Just have a feel for yourself. He took hold of the traveler's hand and directed it over the surface of the bed. But it's a very special sort of cotton that requires a lot of processing. That's why it seems so unnatural and is difficult to recognize as even being cotton. But I haven't yet gotten to that part of my explanation. The traveler had already been impressed somewhat by the officer's explanations. He raised up one of his hands to shield his eyes from the sun, and stood there, looking up and admiring the apparatus. It was of a large and imposing stature. The bed and the inscriber were the larger parts, being about the same size. They looked like two dark, humongous trunks. The inscriber was elevated about 6 feet above the bed, and both of them were interconnected by 4 poles that evidently were made of brass. The sun was reflected off of these poles and practically blinded you. Between the 2 trunks, the harrow was hovering, connected by a steel band. The traveler's earlier indifference was something that the officer had hardly noticed. Now, on the other hand, he was quick to pick up on his increasing curiosity. Hence he paused for a little while in his explanations to give the traveler some time to take it all in undisturbed. The prisoner was imitating the traveler's actions, but since he couldn't raise his hand up to shield his eyes, he had to squint, and even so he kept blinking due to the rays of the sun that were reflected off the brass. "All right, so now the man is strapped in." The traveler picked up the conversation where they have left off. He sat back upon his chair and crossed his legs. "Right," the officer resumed, and at the same time he pushed his beret back and wiped his brow with his sleeve. Indeed, he mopped off his entire face with his hand. "Now, listen up. Not only the bed, but also the inscriber, each has its own battery. The bed needs it for its own movement. The inscriber uses its battery for controlling the harrow. Just as soon as the man is strapped in, the bed begins doing its dance. It vibrates in minuscule motions, jerking very quickly both to the left and right as well as up and down. Perhaps you've seen similar gizmos at the doctor's office or in sanatoriums. Only there's a big difference. With this one, all of its motions have been calculated with painstaking precision. They're precisely aligned with the motion of the harrow. But it's the harrow that, really and truly, carries out the execution of the judgment. "Just what is the judgment?" asked the traveler. "You don't even know that?" The officer was stunned, and he bit himself upon his lips. "Please forgive me if my explanations are somewhat out of order. I'm really very sorry that nobody has informed you of this. That is, earlier on, all of these matters were explained fully by the commander, but this newly appointed commander has backed off from even performing this sacred duty. But then, that he should be so remiss even with such a visitor, a man of your reputation." The traveler attempted to ward off this display of respect using both of his hands, but this didn't do him a bit of good. The officer held firm with his qualifications. Such an honored person, famous throughout the world for his research. And you weren't even informed about what essentially the judgment pertains. This, once again, is an innovation for which... Obviously, he was right on the verge of breaking out into some profanity, but he held himself back and limited himself to saying, "I wasn't aware of this. Nobody told me a thing. The guilt belongs elsewhere. Moreover, seeing how this is the way things are, well, I am the most competent person at explaining our judgments for. You see, I'm the one who carries." And at this point he struck himself upon a pocket that was on his chest. the handwritten renderings that pertain to all judgments, the actual renderings of our former commander. Handwritten renderings sketched by the commander himself? The traveler asked. Was he then so skillful at everything, uniting such divergent fields into one? Soldier, judge, architect, builder, chemist, artist? Jowl, the officer replied, nodding at the same time. His eyes were set in a deeply reflective gaze. Then he took another look at his hands. They didn't seem clean enough so that he might take hold of the leather notebook, and so he went back to the bucket and washed them yet again. Then he removed the small leather case from out of his pocket and spoke. Our judgments don't sound all that harsh. The prisoner's to have the rule against which he transgressed inscribed upon his body. The harrow carries out this function. For instance, as regards this prisoner, the officer pointed at the man. It shall be written upon his body, Honor thy superiors. The traveler glanced over at the man as the officer pointed at him. He had lowered his head and seemed to have all of his concentration focused upon listening most intently, that he might experience something particularly enlightening. All the same, the quivering of his bulging lips that were pressed tightly together, this made it quite obvious that he couldn't understand the least bit of it. The traveler had any number of questions that he wanted to ask, but upon seeing the condemned man with such a spectacle before him, he simply asked, He's been informed about this judgment? No, replied the officer, and he wanted to get right back to his explanations, but the traveler interrupted him immediately. He doesn't even know his own judgment? No, the officer repeated yet again, and seemed to be at an impasse, as if he needed the traveler to provide the reason why this question had so much importance for him. Then he spoke up. It would be useless, just a complete waste of time that we inform him. He'll experience it upon his body, don't you know? The traveler suddenly lost all interest in asking any more questions. But then he perceived a feeling coming over him as the judged man was staring at him, somehow imploring him as to whether he could accept whatever it was that was about to transpire. For this reason, he bent himself forward from out of his reclining posture and asked yet again, But that he's been judged at all, certainly he knows this. Not even that, the officer replied, and he smiled upon the traveler as if he were expecting to be entertained by some other odd paths of inquiry. No, the traveler said and wiped his hand over his brow. Then he doesn't even know how his defense has been received? He hasn't had any opportunity to defend himself, the officer said and looked off to one side, as if he would be speaking to himself and didn't want to offend the traveler because of his total lack of insight into these matters that were all too self-apparent. But surely he must have had an opportunity to defend himself, the traveler protested, and at the same time he rose from out of his chair. The officer suddenly became aware that he was in danger of being diverted for a long while from his explanations, and so he walked right over to the traveler, taking his arm within his own and using his other hand to point at the condemned man who, meanwhile, had become very aware that their attention was directed solely upon him. He stood up as erect as at all possible. The soldier also tightened his grip upon the chain, jerking it taut, and the officer resumed. "Let me tell you exactly the way things are. I've been appointed judge here in the penal colony, and this despite my youth. That's because I was always at the side of our earlier commander in all of the issues pertaining to punishment, and, moreover, I also have the best understanding of the apparatus. The fundamental premise that guides me in all of my rulings is quite simple. Guilt is never in question. There is never any doubt, none at all. Now, of course, I know that there are other courts that are not able to follow this principle. They are composed from any number of competing intellects, a multi-headed hydra, and then they're also subservient to courts that stand above them. Here this simply isn't the case, or at least it wasn't the case by our earlier commander. Indeed, this new commander has already displayed some fondness for becoming enmeshed into my judicial responsibilities. It seems he likes to stir up trouble, but I've managed to keep him at bay so far, and I certainly have no intentions of ever giving him an opening. A major filed his brief earlier on, this very morning. In it he stated that this man, who had been assigned to him as his underling, that he had been caught sleeping rather than performing his duty. His duty, namely, consisted in this, that every hour upon the stroke of the clock he'd stand in front of the major's door and salute him. Now, certainly that isn't such a difficult assignment, and indeed it's quite necessary, since he's been posted there both for the purpose of guarding the entrance, as well as being available for performing any tasks that the major might give him. Hence, he needs to remain alert. Now, the major wanted to verify that he was actually performing his assigned duty, and so last night he opened up his door right as the clock struck 2 a.m., and there he found him crumpled up in a heap and sleeping quite soundly. He went and got his horsewhip and struck him a good blow across his face. Now, rather than standing up and begging for forgiveness, what does our prisoner do? He grabs the major round his ankle, shakes him, and screams out, "Throw down that whip, or I'll tear you limb from limb." That's all fact, everything that is pertinent to the case. The major came to me a little over an hour ago. I wrote down his statement, and then, right away, I also wrote down the judgment. Then I had this man put in chains. All of this is simple, just as simple can be. Now, if I would have called the man before me, and would I first have questioned him, nothing but confusion would have resulted. He would have started lying, and even then, even if I would have refuted his lies, he'd just think up a new set of lies and all sorts of mitigating circumstances, and so it would go ad infinitum. But now I'm holding him firmly. There's just no way that he's going to escape. So, does this satisfy you? Have I clarified the matter sufficiently? But the clock is still ticking. The execution is scheduled to begin, and I still haven't even finished with my explanation of the apparatus. He insisted that the traveller sit back down in his chair, and then went back in front of the contraption and began. As you see, the harrow itself is shaped just like a human body. This part here is for the main torso, and these two portions are for the legs. And then for the head there's just this one small stinger, stitchel. Are you following?" He leaned over a little in the direction of the traveller in a friendly manner, obviously ready to explain everything as fully and as extensively as at all possible. The traveller looked at the harrow with a wrinkled forehead. What he had heard earlier about their judicial process didn't really satisfy him. All the same, he had to admit this much, that what he was observing here was a penal colony, that it was only natural that a different set of rules was necessary, a particular standard of justice that went along with everything else that pertained to the military, and that one had to accept this right down to its last consequences. Beyond this, he was laying his hopes upon the new commander, who quite obviously, even if ever so slowly, had intentions of bringing about some fundamental changes that this narrow-minded officer wasn't capable of appreciating. As a result of this train of thought, he put another question to the officer. "Is the commander going to be present at the execution?" "That's not certain," the officer replied. This question, coming from out of the blue, irritated him, and his friendly countenance started to show signs of cracking. "It's precisely for this reason that we need to hurry up and get on with it. Indeed, despite how much I hate doing so, I'm going to have to shorten my explanations. But don't let that worry you. I'd be more than happy to go through everything in detail early tomorrow morning. The machine should be all cleaned up by then. That it gets to be so fouled, this is the only thing that's wrong about the whole affair. So, for now, I'll have to limit myself to just what's absolutely necessary. Once the man has been placed upon the bed and it has been set into motion, that's when the harrow sinks down upon his body. It has been constructed so that it just barely touches his skin. That is, it self-adjusts so that the points of the needles just graze upon him. Once everything's been set into motion, then these steel cables tighten up, and this forces the commencement of the punishment by the needles. That's when things become interesting. The play begins. Someone who hasn't been initiated doesn't notice any difference in the outward execution of the penalty. It appears as if the harrow works just the same for everyone. It vibrates simultaneously, piercing the body with all of the needles, and, of course, the bed is vibrating right along too. So that it's possible for everyone to observe what's happening and to verify that the judgment is being inflicted properly, the harrow has been constructed out of glass. This brought about any number of technical challenges, particularly getting the needles embedded within the glass. But after numerous attempts, success was achieved. We didn't spare any effort, but worked on this both day and night, and now everyone is able to see the process right through the glass, just how the writing is inscribed upon the prisoner's body. Would you care to step over here for a closer examination of the needles?" The traveller slowly got himself up and out of his chair and walked over to the harrow, leaning over to see. "You'll note," the officer spoke, "the needles come in pairs with a rather complex ordering. Every long one has a short one right next to it. That's because the long ones do all of the writing, while the short ones spray water so that the blood gets washed away, and the script, thus, is always clearly visible. The diluted blood runs along these smaller channels that finally empty into one of these major channels that, in turn, empty into this ditch. as now he was taking pains to make everything as obvious as possible, and he came to the point where the two major channels came together before emptying into the ditch. So he essentially brought his hands together as if he were to be catching it. The traveller straightened himself up and wanted to go back to his chair. He put one hand out behind himself to feel his way to the chair. As he turned himself about, he had quite a shock. The prisoner had followed along behind him when the officer had invited him forward for the inspection of the harrow. He had even pulled the sleeping soldier along with him for a short distance, and, like the traveller, he too had bent over the glass, inspecting the needlework. One could see how he was searching after the explanation for what the officer had been saying, searching all about with his eyes, and yet it was clear that he couldn't make heads or tails about any of it, since he didn't understand a word. He bent himself this way and that, his eyes continually returning to peer through the glass. The traveller wanted to drive him back, for what he was doing was very likely punishable. But the officer took hold of the traveller with one of his hands, and with the other he scooped up a clod of earth from the wall and then threw it at the soldier. With such a rude awakening, the soldier shook himself back to consciousness. Opening his eyes fully, he immediately saw what the prisoner had dared do. He let his rifle fall, and placing his heels firmly into the ground, he jerked violently upon the chain so that the condemned man fell headlong upon the ground, where he writhed about with all of the chains clinking. "Pick him up!" the officer screamed out, and then he noticed that the traveller had been all too taken in by the prisoner's calamity. Indeed, the traveller had forgotten all about the harrow, and his full attention was riveted upon the prisoner. It seemed that his only interest now was as regards what would happen next to this man who was writhing there on the ground. "Handle him with care!" the officer screamed out yet again. He ran around the apparatus, grabbed the prisoner himself underneath his arms, and stood him upright, and did so despite the fact that the prisoner's feet kept sliding out from underneath himself. The soldier did all he could to assist him in this endeavor. "Now I already know everything I need," the traveller announced to the officer as the officer made his way back to him. "Except for the most important thing of all," he responded, and taking him by the arm, he used his other hand to point up into the heights. "Up there in the inscriber is where all of the inner workings take place. It's from there that the harrow's motions are determined, and then the precise movements of the gears are programmed by the renderings of our former commander. Here they are." And he pulled a few pages from out of his leather case. "But unfortunately, I can't ever let them be handled by anyone but myself. These are the most precious of documents that have been entrusted to me. Why don't you have a seat, and I'll show them to you from here? You'll be able to see everything perfectly well." He then held up the top page. The traveller would have been more than happy to express some recognition of what was being shown to him, but all that he saw was a labyrinth of lines that crisscrossed one another to such an extent that it was barely possible to make out a bit of white space in a few areas on the page. "Read it," said the officer. "I can't," replied the traveller. "But it's just as clear as day," the officer responded. "It's certainly done very artistically," said the traveller, attempting to avoid saying anything of substance, "but I can't decipher it." "Yes," the officer replied, and he chuckled to himself as he put the pages back into their leather case. "This isn't the beautiful script that's presented to first graders. You have to study it diligently over a longer period of time. I don't have any doubts that you'd understand it too, eventually. It's just not allowable that it would be a simpler sort of writing. After all, it's not supposed to kill right off. Rather, on the average, it takes somewhere around 12 hours, but then it's during the 6th hour when the turning point becomes evident. It's all been calculated. There have to be many layers of ornamental script. The actual writing encompasses just a small area around the midsection. All of the rest of the body is simply used for various ornate embellishments. Are you there yet? Do you admire the dignity of the work that the harrow and, indeed, the whole of this apparatus performs? Now watch this. He sprung up upon the ladder, turned one of the gears, and called down, "Heads up! Step back to the side!" And everything started into motion. If it hadn't been for the grating noise of the misaligned gear, it would have been magnificent. Herrlich. As if the officer would still have been surprised by this noise, he raised up his fist and shook it. But then, by way of apology, he spread his arms out toward the traveller and hurriedly made his way down, so that he too might observe the motion of the contraption from ground level. But still, there was something else that wasn't quite right, something that only he could notice. He climbed up the ladder once more, grabbed something within the innards of the inscriber with both of his hands, and then finally, so that he might get down as expeditiously as possible, rather than using the ladder, he made use of one of the brass poles to slide down. Down he slid, and so that he might be heard above the grating noise and greatly animated, he screamed out right into the traveller's ear. "Do you see what's happening? The harrow has begun its process of writing. Once it has made its first pass over the back of the man, so the cotton wadding rolls the man slowly over a little to the side so that another portion of his back becomes accessible. And at the same time the places where the script was inscribed come into contact with the wadding which, due to the especial preparation of the cotton, the bleeding is curbed, and the area is prepared for the next pass, when the writing will go deeper still. And watch the edge of the harrow. These scrapers on the edge have the function of removing any cotton that might remain in the wounds. It automatically cleans itself, tossing all of the fragments right into the ditch. This all happens in concert, so that the harrow is continuously given another spot upon which it performs its work, the waltz of ever-deepening chastening. And so it goes, the 12 long hours. For the first 6 hours the prisoner lives pretty much as he did before, only he suffers from the pain of the needles. After 2 hours the felt stub is removed, since the man hasn't the strength left that he might cry out. Here, at the top side of the bed, there's a specially heated bowl into which a warm porridge is placed. The prisoner is able to feed himself by extending his tongue. This is completely at his own discretion. There hasn't been a single instance of anyone refusing his porridge, and I've seen scores of executions. They all scoop it right up, an example of the humane measures that typify our former commander. Only during the 6th hour does the prisoner lose all desire for food. Normally I kneel down here in the front to observe this phenomenon. Hardly anyone swallows their last bite. They simply turn it in their mouths once or twice and then spit it out into the ditch. That's when I have to be especially quick on my toes, otherwise it hits me right in the face. A deep stillness descends upon the man during this 6th hour, the turning point. Understanding never fails to dawn, and even upon the dumbest of the dumb. It starts with his eyes and then broadens out over the entire face. It's a spectacle that might well seduce you, enticing you to place yourself beneath the harrow. But there is nothing else happening other than this dawning realization of what's encoded in the writing. The prisoner puckers up his lips as if he would be listening as intently as possible.